Well, hi there, Professor Jen, little coffee table series today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Always wonderful to be here with you, share ideas and observations. Thank you to Captioning Services for everything that you've done for us. We're really towards the end of my tapings, though I have to say something sort of humorous for me, and I say it with a tone of appreciation. But on campus, so interesting. In my other classes, I have something called straight lecture casts, which include my picture and my live videography that is also taped. So people see a picture of me. So very often I have people on campus now that I've returned to campus after so many years of a hiatus, just being online. And they say, "Hey, Professor Jen." And I say, "Oh, hello." And then they realize I don't recognize them at all. I mean, you can't fake a blank look. And the students will say, "Oh, I've never had you for a professor, but my roommate has had you, or several housemates, and we've had listen to the lecture cast, and sometimes we find them so interesting that we've watched you for years, etc. So we feel like we know you." So of course that really thrilled me, because I try to deliver content that is meaningful, that makes sense, that has to do with our topics, that gives us perspective. So yesterday on campus, near the end of the semester, I was speaking with somebody in the hallway just about things, as it relates to pop culture, criminal justice, poetry, all the topics you see I'm interested in, literature. And somebody came up to me, I'd never seen this student before, and the person said, "Aren't you Professor Jen?" I said, "Yes." "Oh, I recognized your voice immediately. One of my roommates takes your pop culture class, and I listened to the coffee table series." And so, here I was again so thrilled, so humbled, that people like yourselves, obviously some of you in this class must be sharing this podcast with other persons, which is fine. And people respond to it. In fact, I had had an email from another student who I do not have in this class and asked me for some additional reading material as it related to homelessness, houselessness in one of our more recent coffee table series. So I really appreciate all the encouragement and the fact that so many of you seem to have enjoyed this material delivered to you in this fashion, and it's been my true honor to provide it for you. So here we are. I'll begin. I always love a little picture to provide us a little place to have our conversation and to provide insights. So this is a show, Dragnet, 1967, 68, 69. And in media, this show, Dragnet, was syndicated for many years. I would even dare say decades. I don't know if you know how it works, but very often what you and I would call older shows, to be really polite, fashion forward, we could say vintage shows. Sometimes different networks, mainstream, also streaming services, packages, they will buy like a whole series, a whole portfolio of all kinds of shows. In other words, whether they wanted to buy Dragnet series or not, it gets thrown in with other packages for streaming services in different regions. Dragnet was a show, still is a show, that whenever it's on through streaming services, etc., people seem to gravitate towards it. Now, why? Well, first of all, it really is a media time capsule. If we look in the perspective of fashion, I mean, if you clearly wanted to see what 1960s, 1970s fashion looked like, Dragnet would definitely be your show. But today's lecture cast, podcast, coffee table series observation is really going to be about how media and shows for many, many decades has been really providing us with a disservice as it relates to the criminal justice forum. And I'll give you some examples as it relates to pop culture, why I would say such things. I think I have mentioned before in this series that I have been so blessed. I teach criminal justice classes here at RIT. I've taught them elsewhere as well. And at RIT, it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to really use the city of Rochester, county of Monroe, which we're all in, here at RIT, to use that as our laboratory, our academic laboratory. And so I'll do that again for us today. And if I need to draw in examples of other places, I'm always happy to do that. And I tell you where I got the sources. And this should really probably pique your interest, as criminal justice has to do with all of us. So the show Dragnet had a very interesting format. It was a half-hour series, and in a half-hour series, 30 minutes of program time, it's actually like 24 minutes because, of course, we have to have commercials to pay, for all of this media space. And usually in Dragnet, it would show us some kind of a discussion between these two characters who were very straight-laced, very conservative, and they would talk about who it is that they're looking for. Of course, the duration of the show was all about the investigation, and the end was sort of like Aesop fable, the more I think about it, because they would always give you at the end of the show, once they captured their criminals, they would give you the moral of the story. The moral of the story was usually, this is what, and I'm quoting, the usual was, well, this is what happens when you have drugged out, strung out young adults. That was like the moral of the story. Or the moral of the story would often be, this is what happens when you have uneducated, lower class economic persons who aren't interested in providing a stepping stone. So there was always sort of this harsh resolution in Dragnet at the end of the show. It didn't seem to bother people, and it still doesn't seem to bother people, whether it's true or it isn't true. I'll give you an example. So I remember when I was in high school, we would go to health class, right? And we would see these videos. So I think that this is, part and parcel of literary and cultural studies, pop culture as it relates certainly to media, mixed media. In high school, we would see that VCR cart come in, So happy to see that cart. We knew it was film day. They'd show us these horrible films about STDs. I'm laughing because really, I mean, they still didn't scare anybody out of premarital sex, but that was the goal. Anyway, they would show us these horrible films about STDs, and the people had no teeth and they lost their eyesight and their skin was bad and they had organ failure. And, and this film would roll for 45 minutes. And then, of course, the moral of the story was backed up by the health teacher. I don't remember his name. I sort of tuned him out. He was just so weird. Anyway, and the moral of the story was if you don't engage in premarital sex, none of this will happen to you. Now, you know that that's not true. There are people that could even engage in marital relations and still have that happen. You could have a partner that maybe straight out of the relationship brings back an STD. But, back then we were fed a lot of myths. That was part of pop culture, to keep us in line, keep us in check, that overarching sense of fear. If you this, that will happen. So in health class, they would show us these other films, right? So they would have persons. Remember, I went to school in the 70s. So they would have these persons my age that were, they'd start these films and they'd say, I'll just give a name. Oh, Susie was a good student, cheerleader in her class, right? And then they'd say, and it all began with one marijuana cigarette. I mean, I can even laugh about this now, right? And they say it's the gateway drug. Susie now went from amphetamines and pills and black beauties, that was a drug, and 747s, which was sort of like an oxycodone. And they would give this whole list and they'd say, and now look, she's just strung out and forgotten in the street, completely strung out on heroin. Well, of course, we know that maybe for some people, okay, maybe for some people, marijuana is a gateway drug. I don't know. I have no idea. But I do know that there are plenty of people that use marijuana, whether it's in gummies, edibles, vaping, inhaling, whatever, uh, that it has many excellent properties. Even doctors prescribe it. Persons with AIDS, HIV, persons with cancer. I know many people that have like nerve pain, and different aspects of fibromyalgia and neuropathy. That was the word I was looking for, either from diabetes, neuropathy, or fibromyalgia. Apparently, marijuana seems to sort of quiet a lot of the continuous chronic pain. Okay. But certainly I know many people, though it would never really work for me. I don't feel that just because it wouldn't work for me that we should take it away from other people. That these supplements, I mean, I know plenty of people that are on these supplements for these different situations. It wasn't a gateway drug for them. They're not strung out on heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, etc., laying in the street. They go to work every day. They manage their families. And this is a homeopathic slash organic way in which to deal with their pain versus having a synthetic like fentanyl, a synthetic scenario, or what's the other one, gabapentin, to deal with their pain. But see, media, till this day, we had Nancy Reagan. She, if you remember the name, she was the first lady at one time, married to Ronald Reagan. She had started this Just No campaign. The answer was no to everything. Of course, she left out an important component, that there are plenty of people, I'll speak about that. There are plenty of people that were told in the 80s and the 90s that there were certain drugs that were not going to be addictive. We found out that clearly wasn't true. I'll give you a particular example, Ambien. I remember, I don't mind being terribly personal, vulnerable. I'd had some issues sleeping in the early 2000s for a variety of reasons. One reason was the onset of midlife for me. I started to get a lot of arthritic pain. So in the middle of the night, maybe if any of you are athletes, you can relate. In the middle of the night, I would twist and turn, and I would twist and turn the wrong way, and I'd be in a lot of pain. It would disrupt my sleep, etc. And I gone to the doctor and I said, I said, I'm having some difficulty in my 30s, early 40s, staying asleep at night because I have this, onset of arthritic pain. And the doctor said to me, well, I have a way to fix this. I said, how are we going to fix this? And the doctor said, well, I can prescribe for you some Ambien. First time I'd ever heard of the drug. I said, Ambien? I never heard of Ambien. Oh, yes, it's new. It's new. It's wonderful. It's a sleep analgesic. You take it 20 minutes later, you're involved in a very deep sleep. You have a very restful I can hear his voice now. Restful, recuperative sleep, 8 hours solid. Some people sleep 9 hours. They sleep uninterrupted, etc. You'll feel refreshed. I thought, oh my goodness, this is the ticket. This is the answer to the questions I didn't even know I had. So of course I had the Ambien. About 4 months in, I don't know, I started realizing that if I didn't take that Ambien at 10:45 at night, I kid you not, and it was like a 20-minute kind of thing. I would take it quarter to 11. By 11:05, boom, I was out, okay? And I slept exactly, 8, 9 hours without being interrupted from pain. And such deep sleeps that I don't even remember dreaming. I mean, really deep, hard sleep, right? So I remember about quarter to 11 at night, let's say if it was 11:15 and I was out or something, and I ran late a little with these pills, I'd start realizing that my body wanted these pills. You see? But at this point in the game, in my little story, the media started picking up all these commercials because media is very important, especially in pop culture, because that's how we get deliverable goods, services, philosophies, teachings, all these other things, right? Platforms. And they kept pushing Ambience, the answer to everything. I just remember I get like a little jittery, a little nervous feeling, a little anxiety if I didn't have that pill at 10:45. Anyway, so I would take the pill, go to sleep. Middle of the night, I guess, unbeknownst to me, because I'm so busy sleeping, I didn't even realize I was getting up in the middle of the night cooking whole meals. No kidding, no shit. Cooking whole meals, walking around the house. I guess I vacuumed. I'd wake up in the morning, so I thought, right? And I'd say to my kids, who was up in the middle of the night making spaghetti? They're like, you. I said, what? They said, yeah, you. I said, really? Yeah, you were up, you were making this, making sandwiches, eating in the middle of the night. I had no clue. Remember, I went to the doctor. I said, I need to get off this Ambien. I said, it shouldn't be a problem because I don't feel good about sleepwalking. I don't remember a lot of this. I said, I don't feel good about this. I noticed I feel a little shaky. And the doctor sort of said, well, it just must be you. Okay. I said, well, how do I get off? And the doctor said, well, we'll have to taper you off of Ambien. I said, but you said that people aren't dependent on, well, a couple people say it's very hard to get off of it. They have the shakes. See, this is where I was very unhappy because pop culture, on one hand, for many years of my life, built in all of this fear about the use of drugs, how bad drugs are, right? Providing they were illegal drugs, of course. On the same hand, provided us with all this information. Oh, well, if it's legal, right, and it's prescription based, then you're not going to have the same resolution, same issues. It's just not true. So I remember I had to be tapered off of Ambien. I never took it again. And I was sorry, that I put myself under that. I think now that I look back and currently living with the same level of arthritis due to age, etc., activity, I rather live with that than have all these other side effects. I'll give you another example. So I here in the 1970s, right? Drugs were this major gateway for bad things to happen, either physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, economically, in respect, of course, to criminal justice. You were going to wind up in all kinds of trouble, etc. But that was provided it was illegal drugs. So I had my daughter in 1988, and the big thing at that time and it is no longer in the United States. I don't really know what other countries do. I have no idea. In 1988, it was very common practice after delivering a baby, especially here in Rochester, New York, they would give you Demerol. Now, Demerol, if you know anything about drugs, is a very, very serious drug. They give it to us so we could rest right after the delivery. Very addictive drug. In fact, Demerol has no business really, other than for major pain relief, in anybody's system. I remember I had some Demerol for like the first 2 days after I had my daughter, and I just remember being completely zoned out. The more mothers I talk to, my age, same experience. Today, do they give Demerol? Absolutely not. Nowhere on the forefront. Even in C-sections after major surgery, they treat it like a paper cut. You get 2 ibuprofen, and that's it. You know, maybe people might get a little something more if they had some extenuating circumstance, but certainly not Demerol. I look at all these other drugs, fentanyl, right? Fentanyl is used today in so many temporary kinds of um, anesthesia. Like they use it very often now for colonoscopies, right? Why? Because it's very inexpensive. And if it's titrated correctly, it works very quickly. Very small amount just has to be given. And you can wake the person up after 1, 2 hours of a procedure. It's not like a full kind of anesthesia that might knock somebody out 6, 8 hours. This is a little different in application. But yet, we know that fentanyl from the street level, which unfortunately is now ranging from 30 cents a pill here in Rochester to about $2.50. God only knows what it's cut with. But people are overdosing left and right. We have Narcan trainings, we have safe areas, open area drug markets where people also have open use markets. And fentanyl, nobody likes to tell the story, but I don't have a problem telling it, that there are many people that start on legitimized fentanyl for all kinds of pain that wind up at the end of their prescription. I've seen it myself with people that I'm close to, that I work with, that I socialize with, work, worship, etc., that they run out of the prescription and lo and behold, they go to the street here in Rochester to get more fentanyl or what they think is fentanyl. Who knows what the composition is? But it's amazing how we don't tell that part of the story. The part of the story that we hear in media as we heard in Dragnet, is that it all stemmed from illegal use. It's just not true. I know people in my adulthood that had surgeries. You live long enough, you wind up having something, wisdom teeth pulled, people, that's part of living, right? We have to have repairs. The check engine light comes on. I know people that had Tylenol with codeine for, say, wisdom teeth or something else. They ran out of that prescription. Ooh, they're out on the street looking for all kinds of codeine and different kinds of drugs that had that same beyond analgesic effect, okay? But we don't like to tell that story because that story in the media and pop culture wouldn't really be very good if the pharmaceutical companies, Big Pharma, had to admit that these drugs work so well. That's the thing. That's the bittersweet part of it. That the drugs work so well that after the prescription is gone, people are still seeking these prescriptions. Okay. Look at oxycodone. I can't tell you how many people I knew in the early 2000s would go to the doctor. They would discuss something real. They broke their ankle. They had pins in it. They had swelling. They had inflammation. They couldn't put their full weight on their foot. They had OT. They had PT. You could see there was swelling. You could tell when somebody's really in pain. I get it. Or persons I knew that had gunshot wounds, from gangland activity, etc. They were given oxycodone post-surgery. I get that. I mean, I've never been shot. I've seen enough people who are shot. It looks painful to me. I don't doubt it. And then the prescription wears out, right? It gets all chewed up, and then their body still wants the oxycodone. I watched people that I knew at one time who were very dynamic, alert, responsible, happy people turn into absolute oxy craving addicts overnight, doing all kinds of things to get it, lying about different pain. I knew people that had self-injurious behaviors to make sure that they could get more oxy, and they go to the doctor. Now, I have no background in pharmacology, none, okay? But I know full well that they were filling 360 tablets of Oxy monthly. How? Who needs 360 tablets monthly? Even in hospitals, they really don't administer 360, tablets monthly. I've talked to so many hospice nurses, etc. I mean, that was just like an outrageous amount of oxycodone. Just to think that anybody driving at that point in the game to either go get the oxy, come back from the oxy, go food shopping on that level of oxy, I'm not so sure. I'll give you some other examples about media and pop culture. You know, Here in the town of Henrietta, I think there are three marijuana dispensaries. And neighborhoods, some don't want them at all here in Monroe County. Others welcome it because why? It helps the tax base, and it's a product, whether I agree, I disagree, it's a product that seems to sell. And then other related items. I mean, people on Jefferson Road talk frequently about when the dispensary is open, that they get so much traffic that goes to the Chick-fil-A, that goes to the Crumble Cookie, all these places, I know all these goodies, right? Because people have the munchies. People feel, that it would be the right occasion to have some kind of treat, etc., or enhanced, encouraged appetite, whatever. Not my place to judge. But so many of these places do dynamic business because ordinarily maybe they might not sell so many crumble cookie or, pizza or DeBella sub, right? But the dispensaries, they seem to, encourage this kind of consumerism. But then I think to myself, I'll give you an actual example. A place like Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities is a national non-for-profit, and they do a lot with immigration. They also do a lot with the IDDD, intellectual disability, developmental disability populations across the country. They hire a lot of DSP. That's an acronym for Direct Service Provider. They even have commercials on television as it's really become a profound place of employment in and within our culture to work with IDDD persons. Also, we can thank media and pop culture for that. Last 20 years, so many films include persons that have, capacity concerns, capacity issues, capacity uh, uh, deficit. So Catholic Charities even put out a statement about a year and a half ago after the legalization of marijuana that if you're going to work with persons who are vulnerable, you really can't go to work high, that even though it's legal, that driving the car with persons with IDDD, managing persons with behaviors or deficit or physical inability to have activity of daily living tasks, that marijuana, though it's legal, is not really welcome throughout the workday. So, I mean, in that case, as an example, here we're saying we don't want to penalize you and we don't want to debate, but if you wish to partake, please don't do so before you go on to a shift to work with vulnerable population. And I think to myself, it's all these mixed messages in media because on one hand, how do we know, say, nursing staff, surgical staff, radiation technician hasn't partaken in some use of marijuana, whether it's again through gummy, through edible, food source, smoking, etc., vaping, however one chooses. I mean, do I really want to go to surgery underneath somebody else's surgical genius while they're exposed to marijuana? I don't know. I've never been in that situation, I don't think, but I really have to wonder to myself. Media, as it really expresses pop culture for us and showcases aspect of pop culture, media sometimes, in my opinion, picks and chooses how we're going to see the whole industry, how we're going to see the whole drug use industry. On one hand, we're shown all these pictures here in Rochester, countless hours of video. If you listen to the scanner, which is free, by the way, you can download that on your phone. You listen to all these constant phone calls, overdose, people in the car, not conscious, fentanyl, Narcan administered one time, Narcan administered two times. I mean, it's really sad to hear this on the scanner. It goes on all day. I mean, I think the average amount of calls for service with Narcan is somewhere between 60 to 100 calls a day in this general region. That doesn't even include the amount of persons who probably don't call 911, who try to deal with this themselves with their roommates, their housemates, their loved ones, their children, their parents, and Narcan away without ever, interfacing with 911. Sometimes I think that we're so eager to highlight all of the legal drug use that we sometimes put on the back burner all of the illegal drug use because I say we as a culture, we don't want to confuse the two, but they're really sometimes one and the same. I know plenty of people that I just provided you with examples that had legal prescription. We had this DJ on national radio named Rush Limbaugh, a big conservative. And he was arrested at one point for going to different doctors without alerting the other doctors that he was, looking for prescriptions. He would go 6, 7 doctors a week. He'd tell them all about his aches and pains. He didn't even use his insurance. He would just self-pay out of pocket. It would talk about all these aches and pains, and he would absolutely stockpile all these drugs, and he would take them. We don't really like to talk about that aspect of drug use, uh, you know, because Rush Limbaugh was able to maintain his employment, maintain his relationships, etc., until he got caught. He got caught because a pharmacist who has a license said, "This can't be possible that I'm filling all of these drugs for this same person, but it's coming from 6 and 7 different providers, right, for this one illness." Before I remember a time in college, before prescriptions were automated to some degree, computerized. You could go to every pharmacy you could find if you could get the prescriptions in your hand, and nobody really kept track. And then your insurance company, but by the time they caught up with you, you already had the pills in your hand or the liquid. Today, you see it's impossible. They ask for ID, they ask for your birth date. Things today are really in a mainstream mainframe, and it's really very difficult to do this stockpiling unless somebody resorts to illegal, underworld activity in order to get it. Back to the show Dragnet. I see like Law and Order SVU, Law and Order, Hill Street Blues, all these different cop shows. Sometimes I think that it's also unrealistic, especially working in criminal justice, as I have for so many years. People think that they call 911, right? And 911 comes, the bad guy, the bad gal, the bad person is automatically apprehended within a half hour, just like we see on television, and they get, taken to court, uh, adjudicated, apprehended, etc., and they do their time, and it all gets wrapped up in 24 minutes to 30 minutes, and the victims are happy and they feel relieved. It's just not realistic. That's not what goes on. Here in the Allied court systems, which would be Supreme Court on East Avenue, Small Claims Court, Criminal Court for the City of Rochester, County of Monroe, which would be on Exchange Street, in addition to all the little town courts, which have their own legal and constructive corrective systems. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes people are arrested with an appearance ticket. They don't appear until 2, 3 months down the road. Sometimes uh, people have the appearance ticket, they appear, and because there isn't either enough proof, or the county or the city or the town didn't want to spend money on the case, or a witness didn't show, or the complainant didn't show, whether or not the person is guilty or not, the case is dismissed because either the district attorney or some aspect of the judicial system didn't want to spend the money, the time, the treasure, uh, or have affiliative press coverage over things, plenty of things. You learn a lot about justice and injustice and how it really works when people start going to court watch. Of course, these shows that I just highlighted for you as example never really talk about Court Watch, because that really wouldn't be a fun part of the story to have that aspect of reality, as I just shared with you, in the mix of the story. That's not why all of us are watching these shows. We vicariously want to feel as though that the bad guy, gal, person, bad person, got what they deserved. And we want to see the victim, this is why we're watching, in my opinion. We want to see the victim feel resolved, absolved, corrected, uh, vindicated. We want to see them be able to move on, because we're all longing in some strange way to see justice play out in front of us. But that's not how it works. I can't begin to tell you over how many years. I'm going to say some triggering things, so please forgive me. I'll tread gently today before we leave as I wrap up. So many times I see majority of women sexually abused, sexually assaulted, raped. Though I have to say, it happens to men too, you know this, and non-binary persons, etc. But they don't come out so easily from men and non-binary, because we're still in a society where it's just not something that we encourage. I don't know why. And it's something that, other cultures also make it so hard for men, especially, to come out and talk about their sexual abuse, their assault, etc., as a victim. But, you know, very often we see all kinds of people here in Rochester that have been sexually assaulted, violated, raped, in addition to beaten, and all kinds of very, very terrible things happen to them. And they say to me, where's the justice? Excuse me, I had a little sneeze there. They say, "Where's the justice?" I see on TV all the time, and people go to court, and I say, "Honey, this isn't like TV. Sometimes there just isn't enough evidence, or sometimes it's he said, she said they did. There are witnesses, uh, etc." I said, "It just doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes, more often than we care to admit." Many people just continue to walk on with their life, even though they've done horrible, terrible things to you and to other people. They get to go home and they get to move on with their life and they get to smile in all the pictures and they get to go on social platform, Facebook and living their best life, so it seems. And sometimes here, especially in a city like Rochester, which is really very small, and people will say, "Oh, I heard so and so victimized more men or more women." I'll say, "Oh yeah, I heard the same thing." "Oh, how does this person ever get to walk free all of the time? It just doesn't seem fair." Well, no, it doesn't. But if we grew up in the dragnet place in entertainment, media, pop culture, we're just so convinced that the bad guy, the bad gal, the bad person always gets what they deserve. It's very hard to work with persons that have to accept the fact that they're never going to get the validation through seeing their perpetrator do time. It's very, very hard for people to have that realization, especially having been exposed to pop culture and media, where it sort of seemed that, the bad person always was taken into custody and had to do their time. So painful for victims. Very often as I close today, very often I have victims that tell me, since this happened to me, whatever this is, whether it's, sexual assault, robbery, some aspect of crime, Ponzi scheme, white collar crime, theft, etc., DWI. They say, since I become a victim, I can no longer watch these shows because they say, I sit on the couch. That's what they tell me. I sit on the couch and I start to feel something was wrong with me because I couldn't impress upon enough people how much damage this had done to me or the person I love, etc. Uh, and therefore I fell short, and this is why I didn't get any justice. So you see, sometimes it's very triggering. It's very hard. It's very harmful. But it feels wonderful, I have to say. I'm sure for many persons that haven't felt victimized to be able to watch these shows as they relate to pop culture and say, yeah, that's what happens. Yes, and to believe what they are shown, though I have to remind people often it's really a matter of entertainment. It's really not fact. Sometimes pop culture and what's trending is artful, but it certainly isn't always factual. So anyway, my dears, I'll close with that thought that, these shows these shows, I think for the most part, are ideal. I mean, what syndicated television national broadcasting system is going to make any money if at the end of each show they show us, so many aspects of reality called "You're just not going to get justice"? Who in their right mind would watch these shows? Because they would become angry, they would say, then what's the point? People will often say to me, they'll say Chaplain Jen, Professor Jen, or just Jen. They'll say, what is the point in me coming forward? And I will often say, because sometimes we even have to say with our own voice, even if we're the only one speaking and the only one listening, exactly what happened to us, because we need to validate ourselves. That's why. Sometimes we need to tell truth, right? No matter how hard, how ugly, how horrible. Uh, Even if our voice is shaking, you still have to tell it. Even if you're the only one listening, you still owe it to yourself to validate what has happened to you, right? to learn to have compassion for self. People will often say, well, I was the victim of this drug, or I wound up in this situation, the victim of this crime, etc. And nobody was there for me. Nobody showed me any compassion. I'll often say, how hard. Here's the saying I say often, and you do what you want with it. I say, sometimes some truths, some real things will break your heart, but they'll certainly fix your eyesight. You know, sometimes in some very difficult situations, it's like a hurricane. It comes in and it clears everything out, right? Think of it. Or a tornado, right? Or tsunami. Comes in real fast, clears everything out except you. You're still standing, you look around, there's nothing. So you say to yourself, where did everybody go? Well, that is the question. Sometimes we learn who is our support system, or we learn we don't have one. So then the answer to that, I say to people, we have to learn how to be our own best friend. We have to sometimes learn how to be our own support. We have to sometimes learn how to say, gee, the right people weren't there for me, or nobody was there for me, but I was there for me. And sometimes that's very, very important to so many. So I'll leave you with those thoughts today. I wish each of you well. I hope you're enjoying what we call spring here, 2025. It's Thursday. It's like the 10th or 11th, something like that. And I can tell you this, they're talking about snow for tonight. So I'd certainly like April to call March and say, hello, March. We had enough of you. You need to go. We're now in mid-April. We'd like to be April, but I don't think April's going to make that phone call today. So be blessed. I hope this provided you with some insights as to pop culture, media, television shows, how we interface with realities of drugs and crime. And I wish you well always. Bye-bye.